Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening or afternoon. My name is Scott Griffen. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Press Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IPI, just a brief introduction to us and our work. We are a global press freedom organization based in Vienna, and we do work around the world to defend press freedom and independent journalism. We also do work on media innovation and support to independent journalism wherever it is threatened. And we are structured as a membership organization of editors, leading journalists, publishers from around the world who share a common belief in the importance of journalism for democratic society and a commitment to defending press freedom. And in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about our recent press freedom mission to Mozambique, which IPI carried out in August of 2022 in partnership with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. It was the first time actually that IPI has carried out such a mission, which we regularly carry out missions around the world to countries where press freedom is under pressure. It's the first time that we carried out this type of activity in Mozambique, which was in response to years in which we have sort of been documenting attacks on journalists and growing concerns about the situation of press freedom and independent journalism in Mozambique. So the objective of this trip was to travel on the ground, talk to local stakeholders, speak with journalists, media, civil society, and the government to better understand the situation and to sort of push for changes that we felt and that local civil society feels are important to guarantee a better work environment for journalists. We had a very successful visit. We met with a wide range of stakeholders, media, civil society. We also met with a number of government representatives, including the Justice Minister, the Deputy Attorney General. We met with Gavin, which is inside the office of the Prime Minister. And we had, I think, a good opportunity for exchange with government officials. And in December, we published our report from the mission, which highlighted, however, what we feel are a number of very concerning issues, which we'll be discussing today during the panel. And we do believe that there needs to be sort of urgent steps taken to address some of the challenges in Mozambique, which range from the legal environment to impunity for attacks on journalists. So that's what we're going to be discussing this evening. Just to let you know, the chair of the IPI board, Khadija Patel, was scheduled to speak at this event. Unfortunately, she was unable to attend in the last minute, but that's fine. We'll be moving ahead, and we're going to kick off this evening with brief opening remarks. First from Christoph, who's the Director of Media Program for Sub-Saharan Africa from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and then from Gavin Nardocchio-Jones from the High Commission of Canada in Mozambique. And the government of Canada is also providing financial support to IPI's work in Africa. So we're very grateful for their support. After that, and I'll just briefly introduce our three panelists right now. We have Ernesto and Nhanale, who's the Executive Director of MISA-Mozambique. And then we have Tom Bowker, who is the editor of Zitamar News. And finally, IPI's Director of Advocacy, Amy Brouillette. So we'll hear from them after that. So, and finally, one quick logistical note. We will definitely be happy to take questions towards the end of this discussion. So at any time while the discussion is going on, please feel free to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll make sure to address it later on. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me pass over now to Christoph for the first opening remarks. Christoph, thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, boa tarde, and good evening to everybody attending. It's very nice that at this late hour in the day, you find the time to attend this presentation of the IPI report on Mozambique. CAS Media Africa, of which I'm the director, based here in Johannesburg in South Africa, has been cooperating with IPI on numerous occasions in the past couple of years on the African continent. And we do like particularly the approach that one doesn't go with big fanfare into a country, but rather quiet. One tries to talk to as many people as possible from whatever sides of whatever divides about the media, the role of the media, and the way the media has been treated. And that's why we encouraged IPI to do 2 missions in August and September combined, one to Mozambique and the other one to Botswana, of which the report is upcoming. And I think in both places, it has been a rewarding experience for us as CAS Media Africa, for IPI, and for those whom they met and spoke to in the respective countries. CAS Media Africa is trying to encourage the exchange between media people and stakeholder. And this is one such opportunity to try and talk to one another. I'm particularly grateful that while in Mozambique, while the delegation was there, a lot of people from the media community, as well as from government and related institutions, from the diplomatic corps, were willing to speak to the delegation. It is with this input from Maputo that the report could be drafted, revised, debated, and today will eventually be launched. A lot of people, both on the side of IPI and CAS Media Africa, have put a lot of effort into this product because, as we all know, societies need media. They need good, critical, and constructive media, and they need a working environment for media that is sustainable. And we at CAS Media Africa observe in our work in about 40 countries on the African continent that there are people in government and in some governments and in some societies that seem to appreciate the critical role that media has to play. And we do hope that also in Mozambique, this realization finds more and more support. Having said that, I'll hand back to Scott.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you for all of CAS's support for our work, and it's been a really great experience to partner with you on our different activities. Let me now pass it over to Gavin from the High Commission of Canada in Maputo, please.
Good evening. Thanks, Scott. Bonsoir. Boa noite. Thanks so much for the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the High Commission of Canada. For Canada, the promotion and protection of democracy are the cornerstones to foster development in any country, to help build societal resilience, enhance enjoyment of rights. Peaceful, just, and accountable, inclusive society have these rights, and that must include press freedom. As Scott said, Global Affairs Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion was happy to support IPI to strengthen this project, to strengthen the safety of journalists in Sub-Saharan Africa, including in Mozambique. This project began in January 2022 and helps monitor and report on press freedom violations with partners to build capacity and counter online harassment of journalists, particularly women, and train journalists as well in investigating sources and tools of disinformation. The support to IPI runs parallel to Canada's current co-chairmanship of the Media Freedom Coalition, a really interesting international coalition launched in July 2019 with over 50 member states from 6 continents. The MFC, its members work closely with civil society through a consultative network, legal experts through a high-level panel, and with international bodies such as UNESCO, and of course with journalists and media workers themselves. Here at the local level, I'm proud to say that the High Commission of Canada works through a couple of different funding mechanisms to support national institutions in their work in the press freedom and capacity building area. This includes partners like CJI, I saw Luis in the chat, MISA, Equele, H2N, ASAS, SESC, Aliadas, o Grupo das Mulheres Jornalistas para Empoderamento da Rapariga na Comunidade. They have a longer acronym, so I just thought I'd read it out. And upcoming support to UNDP in the context of the elections. If anyone wants more information about Canada's existing programming and how to get involved in some other work, I'd be happy to share that. I would note that with our partners, we're looking to support more work on digital inclusion, cybersecurity, privacy online, and data protection in the Mozambican context. Canada's goal is to increase the capacity of local institutions to tackle the challenges in the sector as a whole. My hope is that the discussion today helps reflect on the really top-notch recommendations of IPI's thorough report. Congrats to Amy, Scott, Cass, and the whole team. This is in the context of our collective global approach to the promotion of media freedom, in my view. To thank our partners locally as well, who supported IPI during their visit. MISA, Ernesto, muito obrigado, and the Embassy of Germany too, Dankeschön to Jana. Canada strongly believes that media freedom is essential to protect human rights and freedoms, as I said before, and digital technology continues to enable potential harms. And the COVID pandemic has also seen an acceleration of restrictions on freedoms offline and online. These trends have also disrupted existing business models, which I'm sure Tom will talk about a little bit, posing an existential danger to independent media worldwide. Media freedom, an independent press, and a transparent approach to access to information are all crucial for the protection of democracy, as they allow societies to hold powerful actors accountable and bring abuses to light. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to discussion. Obrigado.
Great, thank you so much, Gavin. So let's jump right into the content. Thank you. As you can see, our report has also been shared here in the chat, so you're welcome to take a look as we're discussing. And I want to go with, there's a lot of issues that we want to talk about today, a lot of topics that came up during our mission and our meetings with government, civil society, and media. And I want to start today with Ernesto from MISA-Mozambique, which is a very important civil society organization working to defend free expression, press freedom in Mozambique. One of the biggest issues that was sort of hovering over our different conversations in Mozambique was about, in particular, this draft media law, which has received a lot of criticism, a lot of discussion over the past year or two, in terms of whether it is really an effort to improve the space for media freedom or whether it might actually end up restricting that space. So Ernesto, if we could maybe start with that topic, and I also want to thank you for joining us from far away, and thanks for being here this evening. If you could tell us a little bit about maybe the status of this draft media law, give us a little bit of a background, and kind of, one of our main recommendations was that the government needs to take into account civil society input, as well as making sure that the law reflect international standards. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective on whether you feel that that is going to happen, because that is such an important, ingredient in making sure the law doesn't restrict journalism. So Ernesto, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Scott and Anne, thank you for the invitation and for this time. It's an honor for me to be part of this webinar on the press freedom in Mozambique. So my comment will be about the legislative process in the media field in Mozambique. If times remain, I will try to bring another examples to show how the national authorities are attempting media freedoms and also the whole civic space. As I wrote in the regional report on the state of media freedom last year, Mozambique is becoming a country which authoritarian regime, although with formal democratic institutions. From the point of view of practice and political culture, the country has been sliding toward authoritarian regime with human rights violations and attacks against freedoms of expression and press freedom. This trend toward the reduction of the civic space and violation of fundamental rights has been sustained by successive military conflicts, and in particularly the intensification of the fight against Islamic extremism in the province of Cabo Delgado. So the action of defense and security force in Cabo Delgado have been associated with series of human rights violations, including serious case of illegal detention, disappearance, and intimidation of journalists, and the forced close of local media outlets. So in 2021, after a litigating action by the Ombudsman of to the Constitutional Court, or we call it Constitutional Council, requesting or supporting a civil society organization action, which MISA coordinating, the government has forced to repeal the Decree 40, 2018, which imposed a regime of fees and restrictions system for licensing, renewal, endorsement, and including accreditation of both local and foreign journalists, as well as nation autonomous correspondent. So this was 2 years after they tried to introduce it in Mozambique. So I think that is here where the process of introducing legislation against the freedom of expression started. So when they failed in this decree, it's well known that the government didn't withdraw the decree independently. This was forced by the action which we started with the ombudsman at the Constitutional Council. So with the revocation of the decree, the government continued to impose restriction on the exercise of press freedom and has translated the intention into the proposed media laws. So those, as we know that the government were in the process of replacing the existence media law, which is coming from 1991. It's a law 1891, and also is in the process of introducing new broadcasting law. We don't have a broadcasting law. So after 2021 or 20, we as a civil society, we had reached some consensus in the consultation held in 2019. However, the proposal presented in the parliament in December 2020, and it became known in 2021, were full of new elements, many with which were outside the agreed consensus. Much of the new provisions introduced by the government in the final proposal are adverse to the constitutional and key international instruments on the freedom of expression and press freedoms. So those new provisions prompted MISA to join other civil society organizations in an advocacy campaign for the parliament not to pass the bill, in order to ensure an update of the press law to the current technology context, as well as broaden and enhance to space of the exercise of freedom of expression. So we raised the main issue. I can mention some of them, maybe 5. I don't know about the time there. But the first one, or the main one, is that the lack of independence on the media regulatory authority foreseen in the new legal instrument. So the draft media law delegates powers to the government to define the attributions, competence, organization, and the functioning of the specific, also specific qualifier of media regulatory authority. So this is provided in the Article 8 of the new proposal. So what we say there is that this new body is against the the Constitution because it's not independent. Number two, the attempt by the government to control the functioning mechanism of self-regulation of the journalism profession. So what we saw is that the draft media law introduced the journalism profession card, and we consider it an important tool to protecting the profession from potential opportunists who may pose as journalists for their own purpose. However, the document suggests that the professional card constitutes a qualification and a condition for the exercise of the profession. So we think that this is a limitation. And also, the government tries to control as part of the board which will manage the license. The third point is that the limitation of foreign participation in the media sector. The draft media law limits on the hand in the 20% the quota of foreign funding to the media, and on the other hand, up to maximum of 2 correspondents that a foreign media organ or media house can credit in Mozambique. So they came out with this new provision, which limit the number of correspondent media house can register in Mozambique. Also, we mentioned the problem of inoperability of broadcasting law. So what we saw there is that the proposal was made for traditional broadcasting, ignoring all change in digitalization. So this is the main point which we brought. What we felt is that the proposal copy-pasted old broadcasting law, ignoring all changes brought by digital technologies. The last one maybe is the criminalization of journalists for dealing with matter considered to be state secrets. So the proposal of media bill and the broadcasting bill tend to criminalize journalists. The draft media law, for example, imposed limits on journalists in the exercise of their functions in the name of safeguarding state secrets. This provision is seen as being unnecessary, as the onus of safeguarding state secrecy, secrets of justice, and professional secrecy, because we think that professional secrecy lies with the entity holding those secrets, not journalists being responsibilized by violating national or security secrets. So other recent legal measures attempting freedom of expression, association, or press freedom. In Mozambique, for example, in May 2022, the government sent a draft amendment to the parliament to establish the specific legal regime applicable to the prevention, repression, and combating of terrorism and action related to terrorist acts and organization, which state, so this state in Article 19. So what they say is that anyone who by any means disseminate information classified under this law shall be punished by imprisonment from 12 to 16 years. So in turn, in paragraph 2 of the same article states that the one who intentionally disseminate information according to which a terrorist act has been or is likely to be committed, and knowing that the information is false, is punished with imprisonment of 8 and 12 years. So we came out with an advocacy action. So we were able to work with the parliament to amend this situation. In October, yes.
Oh, sorry, no, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, so maybe this is the last point, because in October, responding to counter-terrorism measure and money laundering, the government approved a bill proposal to substitute the current civil society organization law without consultation, and part of bringing all provisions stated in the law of prevention, repression, and combating of terrorism. The bill brings a restrictive measure for the civil society organization. So in the analysis of this document, MISA claims that the bill is anti-democratic, violates the international standard of freedom of association, violates the constitution provision in the freedom of association, and also gives total power to the government, interfere in the civil society work. For example, approving plan and report, also monitoring civil society work. So, Scott, I will stop at this moment from this point. The bill continues in the parliament. We were expecting to have it revised and approve it last year in the last meeting of the parliament, but also it was in their agenda, but nothing was done, sorry. So, we expect that next February they will maintain the point of agenda. If not, I think that with election coming next year, I'm not sure that they will discuss, if they fail to discuss the media proposals in the next meeting. So if things goes like that perspective, I'm sure that only in the next term, the media law will be again part of political agenda. So there's a risk of this point of agenda be lost again. I want to remember you that this is coming from 2004, when our country introduced the second amendment of the Constitution. So the process were started in the 2004, yes. No, 2004. In the mandate of Armando Guebuza, the first mandate of Armando Guebuza. Yes, so thank you for.
Thank you, Ernesto, so much for that really comprehensive overview. I think a lot of your comments echo our findings in the report. I think, starting from this erosion of media freedom over the past few years that has been identified under the current under NewsAmy, and the specific challenges in the legal environment, which we also go into in the report. And the 5 points that you mentioned, I think, are key about the media law, and again, the lack of or the many areas in which the law currently, or the draft of the law doesn't currently correspond to international standards. So a lot to talk about there. We have a number of recommendations related to the legal situation in the report. But for now, I want to jump over to Tom to give us another perspective. Tom Bowker, who is the editor of Zitamar News, and his name was sort of internationally in the press in 2021 when he was expelled from Mozambique. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. We'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your experience, if you could just give it a little bit of a background, why you were expelled from the country, talk about maybe a little bit the issue of accreditation for journalists or foreign journalists, and sort of how that is used to control the work of domestic and foreign media, and sort of what that says for you about the wider atmosphere for press freedom in Mozambique. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight. And yeah, as you've asked me to just go over briefly what happened. And I think, in a sense, what the lesson to draw from my case is that it doesn't really matter what laws Mozambique passes, because the authorities tend to do what they fancy anyway, and it's not really a place where the rule of law prevails. And I think that was the case in my case, at least. There wasn't really a legal foundation for what happened to me, which is not to belittle the importance of the new media law, because the more repressive laws are brought in, the easier it is then for the authorities to actually crack down on the activities of media. So I don't say that to to belittle the importance of it, but also bear in mind that you know, whatever's in the law is not necessarily what is enforced. So it's just a very potted history of well, I guess how I came to be in Mozambique. And I went to Mozambique because I fancied going to Mozambique for a year or two, and I went as a stringer for Bloomberg, and that's how I first got accreditation with Gabinfo. So that was all perfectly normal. And then after about a year, my wife and I set up Zitamar News as a news site to provide more detailed news on Mozambique than we could do for an international agency. I changed my accreditation with Gabinfo to be under the name of Zitamar News. I somewhat expected at that point then to say, hang on, you can't just set up a blog and get yourself a residence permit in Mozambique as a journalist for that, but they didn't. And so that situation went on for 3, 4, 5 years. Zitamar became a well-established presence on the Mozambican media scene. We were, you know, locally and internationally well-known and a credible organization. We weren't regulated by Gabinfo. We decided to structure it as a foreign publication for which basically I would be a foreign correspondent based in Mozambique for this UK publication. And that all sort of went on fine. And Gabinfo, throughout the whole period, were entirely uncurious to find out as to you know, what our structure was, how we were operating, whether or not they felt they ought to be regulating us. Until one day they decided they didn't want me to be there anymore. So I was called in to Gabinfo for a meeting with the head of Gabinfo. They sort of listed a series of accusations of things they accused me of doing, most of which just had no bearing on reality. They had no interest in hearing my side of the story. I asked if I could bring a lawyer. The head of Gabinfo said she wasn't authorized to speak to a lawyer. I don't know what authorization she would require for that, maybe from the Prime Minister. And so so they demanded I hand in my press card. They didn't give me anything in writing. I wrote to them afterwards to explain why I thought they were wrong. Anyway, yeah, ultimately you can only kick against these things for so long. And I gave in my accreditation card and then sort of waited. And it was about a month or 6 weeks until I then got a call from immigration to go to their office downtown, at which point they confiscated my and my family's passports and residence permits, and told us to leave in 5 days, which sort of dragged out to about 3 weeks, I think. As again, it was done informally, and you know, eventually when I was deported, whoever it was who was trying to get me kicked out had managed to get the Interior Minister to sign my expulsion order, so that was really that. And that comes with a 10-year ban. The 10-year ban is nothing personal to me particularly. It's just in the law. If you get expelled, if you get your residence revoked, you are banned for 10 years. You can appeal, and maybe I will at some point. I've been more concerned with building life here in Europe since then, but it'd be nice to have the option to go and see Mozambique again. And I think, you know, as I say, I think, you know, with a decent lawyer and a straight judge, I think my expulsion would be overturned. Yeah, so, but yeah, it depends on on getting a judge who's prepared to take a decision based on the law, rather than if there's any political incentive to do otherwise. And I don't know what the political attitude towards me is, if any. Maybe they've forgotten that I exist. So yeah, so that, I mean, well, so that's one way in which the question of accreditation can be used against people. I mean, I guess the killer argument for them was that we couldn't produce any proof that Zitamar was an accredited media organization anywhere, and I mean, I'm not going to attribute any good faith to Gavinfo in this process, but I guess they were surprised and couldn't get their head around the fact that doesn't exist in the UK. There are voluntary regulatory schemes you can join, but you don't have to. And I understand from their point of view. I mean, how do they know that Zitamar is real? But I think by the time 2021 came around, Zitamar was clearly a real thing, which was contributing to the media environment in Mozambique. And I was clearly in Mozambique as a legitimate journalist, and that was what I was doing. And you know, I like to think doing a reasonable job of it. But actually, Ernesto's rundown of the new law makes me wonder whether I've got something wrong about it. Because one of the things, and I haven't gone through it with a fine-tooth comb like he has. One of the things that's interesting me as someone who still runs a publication focused on Mozambique from outside of Mozambique is the restriction on the number of correspondents you can have. I mean, depending on how you counted it or how you formally classified people, we have well, a few Mozambican correspondents on the ground, and if we were forced to just have two, then we would have to think about how we approach that. I'm wondering now, is it actually, and maybe we can come to this in a Q&A at the end, is that law actually about just being able to bring in two correspondents from abroad? Because if so, then I think that's a lot more reasonable than it seemed to me to be. I mean, I on a first reading, I thought this was about the number of correspondents in the country you could have, including Mozambicans, which would be particularly difficult for things like the German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, who have 10 or 15, I think, around the country. Yeah. But maybe it's only an issue about the correspondence you need to accredit, which would be basically foreigners, and maybe arguably having two is enough for anyone. I can't think of anyone who has more than that, probably.
Yeah, well, from what I understood, we discussed many of these issues with Gavin. It'll be great to hear Ernesto's expert opinion on that. But yeah, I think for them, they don't believe that more than two people are necessary to be in the country to run these media outlets. And if there are more than two people, then organizations like Deutsche Welle or Lusa should set up their own media in Mozambique. So their argument was that you don't need more than two people, one reporter and one photographer. So that's pretty much it from their side. So that was certainly one of the problematic provisions in the law. And we also made a recommendation about that. So we can definitely circle back to the law. I do want to maybe now just to bring over Amy and then come back maybe to Tom and Ernesto at the end. So Amy, we've talked a lot about a couple of issues. You worked actually on the report and were with us in Mozambique. I think it would be great maybe to give us a picture of some of the other issues that we discussed. And I want to say that both Tom and Ernesto, I think, hit on one of the sort of top line findings that we had, which is there's sort of this all these areas in which the government has informal control over media. So in some cases, the laws themselves are not actually too bad, but there's a system of informally controlling the press, one of which is this very sort of murky licensing and accreditation system. And we see that this new media law kind of has the goal of formalizing these ways of controlling the press. So that's one big topic that we talk a lot about in the report. But Amy, I want to pass it over to you to maybe to summarize sort of maybe just the top line finding, but also some of the other key issues that we encountered and discussed in Mozambique, one of which is obviously this question of physical safety and impunity for journalists, as well as media capture. So Amy, if you could take us through that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining. So yeah, I think our colleague dropped in a copy of the mission report in the chat. So for those who haven't seen it, you can certainly look at it, and it's also on our website. So yeah, I think, I'm not going to go through every single, point that we made in the report, but I'll just kind of talk about a few of the biggest challenges and pressures on press freedom and independent journalism that we identified based on our conversations and our discussions with a pretty wide spectrum of stakeholders with whom we met in Maputo in August. So first is kind of an overall atmosphere of legal and regulatory uncertainty that we've kind of touched upon already. That was, definitely one of the main overarching findings that we drew from our meetings with both members of the media community and government representatives. So for instance, despite there being legal guarantees for press freedom and access to information, these laws are not consistently implemented, and in practice, journalists told us that they operate in an environment of strong kind of informal political control. And this kind of legal and regulatory uncertainty and informality has a very strong chilling effect on the media. And many of the journalists with whom we spoke said that while they feel free to write about any topic that they wish, unless they kind of cross certain red lines. So for instance, reporting on corruption and reporting on the conflict in Cabo Delgado. And another kind of related concern is about the government control over and influence over the broader media landscape. So many in the media community with whom we spoke reported concerns about increasing media capture or the growing influence of the government over private and independent media in Mozambique, as well as kind of the shrinking space for independent media in the country. So overall, while independent media exists, we found that the media landscape kind of broadly lacks diversity, is heavily dominated by state and TV and radio, and the commercial sector, and a commercial media sector that is increasingly influenced by the government. And this lack of media diversity is especially apparent outside Maputo, where internet reach is much lower. And many of the independent journalists and editors with whom we spoke were also worried about their ability to sustain themselves financially, as the government has used the distribution of advertising revenue as a way of exerting control over independent media, and to, in some cases, punish critical media for unfavorable reporting, and then rewarding outlets for pro-government coverage. So smaller independent media outlets are especially vulnerable to this type of government capture, since these outlets rely heavily on advertising for survival. And a third, I guess, and very serious challenge and concern is the issue of the safety of journalists in Mozambique. Many of the journalists and editors that we spoke with described operating kind of in a growing climate of fear due to an increase in physical threats and harassment and attacks, both on individual journalists and on media houses, combined with a culture of impunity for these attacks. The most notable case is that of journalist Abraham Mbaruko, the community radio reporter who disappeared while reporting in Cabo Delgado in April 2020. Authorities to date have produced no findings on his fate. And in addition to attacks on journalists working in Cabo Delgado, there have also been widespread reports of attacks and harassment and intimidation of reporters in other parts of the country, including in Maputo. So when we met with the Attorney General's office during our mission, we raised these cases as well as our kind of broader concerns about the culture of impunity for these crimes. And while the office, in our estimation, was quite willing to discuss the cases with us, to our knowledge, there's been no further progress made on these cases, on some of the key cases that we raised. So we recommend to we put this in our recommendations in the mission report, but we did verbally recommend that the government take concrete steps to improve the accountability for all of the reported cases of violence against the press. And including by establishing clear and transparent mechanisms for investigating all reported attacks. So I think I'll stop there, but one last thing I'll say, and I think Scott mentioned it previously, is that what we heard from many in the media community was that there's kind of a combination of pressures from the unclear legal and regulatory system to the market pressures to increasing attacks on journalists. And this kind of illustrates the broader deterioration of press freedom since NewsAmy took power in 2015. He himself has engaged in direct attacks on the press, which is also a great concern to IPI, as this type of anti-press rhetoric by political leaders that we see in actually many parts of the world often creates a climate of intolerance towards the press and puts journalists at further risk. I think I'll stop there and maybe we can open it up to others.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Amy, for summarizing some of those additional points. I think especially this issue of physical safety is a major one, and also the impact of what's happening in Cabo Delgado on the media's ability to report and also access to that region. So I would just remind participants, please feel free to go ahead and put questions in the chat. Raise your hand if you have a specific question or point you would like to make. In the meantime, maybe just coming back to a question maybe for both Tom and Ernesto. Ernesto did touch on this a little bit, but I'd be curious to know how both of you see the impact of the upcoming elections on the situation of press freedom in Mozambique. Given what we've talked about, that there's sort of been this increasing pressure on the media, do you think that this pressure will increase as we get closer to elections? That the environment will sort of become even more restricted for the media? Is that where things are headed? Or is the government going to be open to resolving some of these issues? I don't know if either of you have sort of a view on that.
Thank you, Scott. It's difficult to make a prevision, but we can use some data of previous elections where we faced some challenges. Specifically in the province where political candidates were targeting journalists, specifically the local journalists. So we dealt with some case of violations. I think that this will be maybe an indicator of what will maybe happen, but looking also to the national political process itself shows that we will have a very difficult electoral contest because of ruling part transactions and also because President Philip Nyusi is going to end his term, but we are facing this military and also we are discussing now if we will introduce or not the local election. Digital election has a part of decentralization package, which was agreed between Frelimo and Renam in the previous election. Remember that we hosted in last electoral process, the provincial elections. So now the president in December launched, before he agreed that 2024 we will have digital election. Now they are in doubt if that will happen or not. So I think that this shows the trends of change in the political mindset on the local election. Maybe the ruling party is afraid to lose some district. So this will bring a kind of pressure to control the trends of political opinion in the society. So if we think like that, this pressure will also directly impact in the media landscape. That means that there will be a trend of controlling media content. And also I think what is happening now is that in Mozambique, maybe Canal de Mozambique is the only one who is surviving, still surviving. But today, what we can say is that all of them captured. Even those we were thinking that they are independent. Those are historic ones fighting for independence for media are now being captured by the ruling party. But this is a kind of preparation of minds, and also that I mentioned in the legal perspective, that the civic space is being controlled using all mechanisms. So this is also something which I think that will be, so those strategies will be used also to control the public space for the mainstream media. I don't know how this will be to online media like social network, but I think that they will install something, or they will intensify the spin doctors action in the Facebook, and also the increase of fake news, which will be very dangerous for our democracy. So it's what I think, and I feel that we will face for the next election.
Thanks, thanks Ernesto for sort of painting that picture for us. I want to give Tom also a chance to respond to that question, but maybe just first, I saw a hand up, I think, from Stefan Ehler. Do you still have a question that you would like to ask? If so, just unmute yourself.
Sorry, I have so many questions. That's why I took my hand back. I mean, you know, I don't know what you are expecting. The last elections show very clearly who is in power, and I don't think the next elections will show something else. Journalists who are critical and in areas where, I don't know, even military is active. I mean, you know, I would really like to know what you are expecting from Mozambique. And maybe if I may pose one question, I spent one night at the last year's New Year's Eve party. It's World Bank, European Union, it's everybody. I mean, I think at minimum there's $2 billion or euros paid by donors to Western donors to Mozambique every year. And nobody asks questions, you know, the money is flowing, education is not going up, development is not going up, nothing is going up, it has not been going up for years. And still we discuss now press freedom. I'm very much behind this effort, but I think that certain structural things need to be discussed.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a specific question for us. I mean, obviously, we believe that press freedom is a necessary element of development. Yeah, let me maybe pass it over to, sorry, we have actually one question in the chat, and then I'll throw it back to our three panelists. So it's from Gavin, conscious of Tom's opening points about the rule of law. Where do we see the best institutions or persons to target in Mozambique? I'm assuming when advocating on bringing the new media law up to international standards. And I've also just seen another new question here. What can be done by the international community to protect journalists and journalism in Mozambique? Yeah, I don't know who might want to jump into that. Amy, maybe you would like to say something about what the international community can do, and then still want to hear from Tom on his views about the upcoming election. And any of you have a comment on what's the most important institutions in Mozambique to target in terms of advocacy?
Sorry, were you directing that towards me, Scott? Sorry.
So yeah, this is the
one. Yeah, I can try to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think the two questions are a bit related, actually. I would actually kind of almost throw the question back at Gavin to ask what he thinks would be like useful institutions, at least in the diplomatic realm of like, how could we kind of advance some of the recommendations that we've been making in our report. But in terms of international, the second question on the international community to what can the international community do? I mean, there's a lot of kind of, awareness raising, obviously, and I hope that this is contributing to that. And we hope that, missions like this will kind of raise attention around the issues that Mozambique is facing in terms of press freedom, and try to kind of at least provide good recommendations for how to ensure that, at least in the legal standards in particular, that the laws can be revised in line with international human rights standards.
Thanks, Amy. And actually, now we got another question from Joseph. Would you like to briefly unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I've been a journalist in Mozambique for 40 years, believe it or not, on and off as a foreign correspondent. And one of the things that I think is important is exactly the New Year's Eve party, because the role of the international community in Maputo is actually very important. And it was partly the pressure from the international community that stopped various of these bits of repressive legislation from being tabled. And I think that what you're seeing now is that Mozambique is really important for the international community for the aid side, because there's all this money going into Cabo Delgado and all this money, and everybody has big budgets. And for contracts, huge contracts for the gas. And the government has made very clear to the international community that you do not step out of line. You do not criticize the government. You will be penalized for this. And what we are seeing is that, for instance, with the elections, all of the donors 4 years ago criticized the elections hugely. They have not opened their mouth this time. There's very little funding for observation. And they've been told, you can't do that anymore. And what is happening is spending money is more important for the donors and getting contracts for all sorts of reasons than any changes. And so I think the difficulty is, how do we bring pressure on the international community when the ambassadors and aid people are afraid to speak out, are afraid to fund, increasingly afraid to fund criticism of the government. And I think this is a kind of core issue. Now, I want to throw out one totally contradictory thing. Having been doing Mozambique for a long time, I was editor 4 years ago for the Mozambique Political Process Bulletin election newsletter for the Public Integrity Center. And we were able to publish extremely critical reports, and nobody stopped us. And one of the reasons we could do that was we had 400 correspondents And electronic communication makes a huge difference. Now, I go back to the previous war, and we're getting more detailed coverage of the Cabo Delgado War than we did on the 1980s war, because we have so much better electronic communication. We know much more about the Cabo Delgado War than we did about the much more serious war 30 years ago. And the government hasn't been able to stop that. It's partly because of ACLED, partly because of their number of ways of getting material out, but it's also possible that they haven't been able to crack down on social media, and which I think they would very much like to. So I think we're in a position now where, in part, from better organization and electronic media, we're actually better informed about elections, about the war, and the government is desperately trying to crack down on that, desperately trying to stop that. And I think that it depends very much on the international community. Are they really too afraid to speak out? Or will they be willing to say something about press freedom, election coverage, war coverage, many of these things that are important? But I think we need the international community to perhaps be a bit more brave. And I don't think their capitals are going to allow them to do it. I think they're just too interested in pumping aid money into Mozambique and getting gas and minerals contracts. Sorry to be cynical.
No, thank you so much for those comments. I think, like, two important messages there. One, definitely the importance of having the international community speak out. That seems to be one of the themes of the comments here, and I think that's something that we absolutely agree with. We need sort of that strong push and willingness to criticize the government. And I think the other comment is also very interesting about the ability of the government to control online communication, or their interest in doing so. We talked a little bit about surveillance, for example, during the mission, control of speech on social media. So I think these are really important issues as well. I think if we had more time, I would want to dive into that even further to sort of ask our panelists where they see that headed. How big of a threat is that at the moment? So I think those are really, really interesting comments. Thank you very much for that contribution. I'm conscious of time. Tom, I know I said I kept wanting to come back to you. Is there anything you want to add to this conversation? Anything you were hoping to say earlier?
I could maybe just briefly come back in on. I mean, I think yes, Joe is right about many things, but and being someone involved in the joint project with ACLED, getting news out on Cabo Delgado, yes, definitely, technology now is completely different to what it was in the 1990s, and I don't think the new law is really up to date on that either. And I suppose that's the flip side as well of why I think the new law is going to be slightly irrelevant, or at least for me, because there's just not that much in the modern information age that Mozambique could do about an operation like Zitamar, particularly now that they've forced us to do it from outside the country. There's very little that they can do to stop me communicating with correspondents in Mozambique and spreading our news in the country. To come back on maybe just a forecast for the elections, and I think people's pessimism is justified, but as Ernesto said, there's too many unknowns at the moment, and I think a lot of it will depend on whether Frelimo actually feels like there's a credible challenge to it in the election, which is unlikely. But were the opposition to get its act together in a so far unimaginable way, or questions around, if Frelimo were to tear itself apart over the choice of the next presidential candidate, things could get a lot tighter for journalists. But even with a cakewalk like it was last time, journalists are going to feel the pressure around the elections for sure.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for that. I think that in the interest of time, we may need to go ahead and wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for taking part in this evening's discussion. Really appreciate the expertise, in particular from Ernesto and Tom, and thanks a lot as well to Gavin and to Christoph for their opening remarks. Again, we have put the link to our report in the chat. We do hope to have a version in Portuguese available soon. Right now, it's only in English. Of course, we are available at any time for comment. IPI is looking forward to continuing our work in Mozambique. And despite what is clearly a challenging situation, I think we've heard that in the run-up to the elections, things may get worse. There is a amount of due pessimism that we plan to stay engaged and follow up on the recommendations. And I think, again, we've heard how important it is for the international community as well to speak out and be willing to criticize the government where necessary. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Good evening and goodbye.